Hi, I'm Mrs. Sloan, and this is a video for my AP Biology students and some honors biology students too. This is discussing the conservation of biodiversity. And for my AP students, this is their final chapter, so this is pretty exciting. So let me make myself a little bit smaller, and if you don't know, there is a link in the descriptor of this video at the bottom, and that link contains the notes that my students use. Two columns. Column one is the scaffolding. I'll help you fill in those notes. Column two, I encourage you to throw in pictures that I show you here or online to help you when you're studying this material. So, conservation of biodiversity. This is part of our final unit on ecology. And so this is a link you can use, and it has the College Board expectations. And this particular chapter is linked to 8.6 biodiversity and 8.7 disruptions to the ecosystems. I encourage you to pause and take a quick read through of these so you know what's expected of you when you take your AP exam. So first of all, let's talk, I'm in the way. Let's talk a little bit as an introduction on success and concern. There's a great success when you look at the brown pelican. It was on its way to extinction, and in 1970, it was put on what's now known as the endangered species list. A remarkable comeback, and in 2009 it was removed from the endangered species list because of the actions that we took, right? And then right now, currently a problem is the lionfish. It's native to Southeast Asian coral reefs. That's where it evolved in its ecosystem, and they're top predators of that ecosystem where they developed. And people have put them in fish tanks because they look cool. And then as few as like 5 or 6 were released off the Florida coast, where they had no natural predators because they're non-native. They are an exotic species, and they are just decimating the coral reef biodiversity in the Atlantic coast as well as the Caribbean. And what we'll learn in part 2 of this video, this is part 1. In part 2, we will discuss some of the causes of extinction, and exotic species are involved in 50% of all known extinctions. All right, so we will talk about conservation biology. I need a pointer. Here we go. All right, and on your notes, this is 47.1. And conservation biology studies biodiversity in order to conserve natural resources, And it involves application as well. So here's some basic biology, right? And then this is where you could apply fisheries, range management, wildlife management. Those are all applications of that. Now, biodiversity positively influences ecosystems. First, I'm going to explain what it is, and then I'll tell you some direct and indirect values in just a few minutes. So, the premise is high levels of biodiversity is desirable because it positively influences the stability. That's the word you need for your notes, the stability of ecosystems. Now, just like we used bioinformatics earlier when we were talking about genomic research, you can use bioinformatics to research and look for problem-solving management in biodiversity as well. So remember, biodiversity is the total variability of all the species, the genes, and the ecosystems. But there's a link to this article right here, is recently the advancement of bioinformatics. It's just high-powered computers, right, to study the molecular events using data obtained by exhaustive experiments as whole genome sequencing, functional annotation, expression analysis, etc. But to really understand the value, you have to also look at genetic information with native habitat, neurobiology, and physiology, and you need to look at phylogeny to really understand all aspects. So this chapter kind of ties together several of our units. And on your notes, you have everything you need for that. All right. Next, when we look at biodiversity, like I mentioned before, it's the variety of all life on Earth. And when we look at the number of known species, there's so many yet to be discovered. There's probably maybe 10 million species out there, and we know about 1.3 million of them. Most of them are invertebrates. Vertebrates only make up about 5%, and you can see that here. So of all the species, if you get identified as endangered of those species, you are in danger of immediate extinction. So endangered species face immediate extinction, whereas threatened species are in danger of becoming endangered. So threatened species are likely to become endangered. So let's look at some of those threatened species. And here are threatened species. This is from 2008. I probably should have updated this. You can see the different countries and what species then are threatened, identified by mammals and birds and reptiles, etc. And look at the plants right here. Ecuador, right? On the equator, right? Where the climate conditions are so good for all of those producers, and then all of those consumers depend upon them. So a little side note I want to go into. Let's see, do I want to go into it? Yes, I do. Sorry. Biodiversity is important to the health of the biosphere, and there are basically 3 types that we want to look at. So the first type is genetic diversity. And it is exactly what it sounds, your genes, right? And so on genetic diversity, populations with high genetic diversity are more likely to survive a change in the structure of their ecosystem. So you want to think about like the Irish potato famine, the wheat famine in the Soviet Union. When you have these uniform crops, you do not respond well to changes. And I gave you a couple more there in your notes. And also we want to consider that we want that, it's important to preserve that biodiversity because that's a source of DNA. We could do some genetic engineering and transfer those genes, just like we did when we moved the human insulin gene into bacteria. Maybe we could produce crops that are disease resistant, increase nutritional value, more resistant to pests. Okay, so there's something called the MVP, and this is a little side note, and this is minimum viable populations. So for instance, you might set aside, look and think, well, we did this great thing. We have Yellowstone National Park, we have the Grand Tetons, and we've set aside this space in order to preserve a species. But the reality of what we need to preserve that species so they have a large enough population is sometimes not done. Because what can happen is you lead into this vortex of extinction. So an MVP is the smallest possible size at which a biological population can exist without facing extinction. And on your notes, I have it on there. It's lost when the population is too small, right? When you're not caring for the population at a size that is sustainable. When it's too small, this leads to inbreeding and then random genetic drift. And there's a place for you to put that in your note. So it's loss of genetic variation due to non-random mating and genetic drift can trap it in this extinction vortex because they lose genetic variability. They reduce their fitness, lower reproduction, higher mortality, which makes the population even smaller on repeat until extinction. So then one key factor is the loss of genetic variation necessary to enable evolutionary responses to environmental change, such as the appearance of new strains or pathogens. So that's why it's so important to do number 1, your genetic diversity. All right. Number 2 is community diversity. Community diversity is just that, remember when we looked at Simpson's diversity index, right? And we can do the calculations for that now. You want to have a variety of different species within your community. And it's very short-sighted to only protect one and not think of all. So community diversity, diverse community compositions increase the levels of biodiversity in the biosphere. And then the third one that we want is landscape diversity, right? We want to have a lot of different conditions, a lot of different landscapes with various abiotic and biotic factors, so we can have a more diverse spread of species. So on landscape diversity, studies landscape interactions. And then on top of that, we talked about island biogeography, right? So let's apply that right here. Some of these landscapes end up getting fractured by things like roads. And so this fragmented landscape can reduce reproductive capacity, food availability, and affect seasonal behavior like migration patterns. So some landscapes are so fractured, it makes it difficult for organisms to move from one to another. Okay, and then we need to remember that biodiversity is not distributed evenly. There are some hotspots that we really need to work to protect. To qualify as a biodiversity hotspot, a region has to meet two strict criteria. It has to have at least 1,500 endemics. They're only found there, vascular plants, where they're found nowhere else, and they are irreplaceable. And they must have 30% or less of its original natural vegetation in place. So it must be threatened. And so many of the heavily threatened by habitat loss, that's number one, and other human activities. And we want to remember that forests and other remnant habitats and hotspots represent just a small percentage of the Earth's land surface, but a very viable and important part. So on your notes, I have biodiversity is not equally distributed. We should focus on areas with the greatest density, and generally those are closer to the equator. And they contain large concentration of species. Only 1.4% of the Earth is actually designated as a hotspot, but that 1.4% contains 44% of all known higher plants and 35% of all terrestrial vertebrates. So we really need to protect those. And this is a link if you would like to explore some of the biodiversity hotspots. All right, so then why is biodiversity important? So I want to go back, right, because we talked about what biodiversity is with genetic and community and landscape biodiversity, and we know that biodiversity is not evenly distributed. So now, why should you care? Why is it important? And that to have the greater the biodiversity, it provides both direct, like you can see the direct value, and also indirect value. Now, as we well know, money talks. Direct economic value. So for instance, there's the three big ones is we need biodiversity for medicines, for agriculture, and for consumptive use. And possibly that's where your argument is, right? Because money talks. This is for you. And if we educate people on the values of biodiversity, maybe they will work to preserve it. So medicinal value. So on your medicinal value, the first thing I want you to know is that most US prescription drugs were originally derived from living organisms. So if we are currently eliminating those organisms, probably not a good idea, right? Because they could be a source of new medicines. And based on past rate of drug discovery, there's about $100 billion worth of value, probably more even today, that could be found in just the tropical rainforest. So the note on your notes, you just need most US prescription drugs were originally derived from living organisms. And then I gave you the rest of those. A few examples, and these are also in your notes as well, is treatment of leukemia, especially childhood leukemia, antibiotics like penicillin. There was a leprosy cure that was found from an armadillo who contracted human leprosy. An amoeba found in a horseshoe crab now keeps pacemakers free of bacteria. All right. Next is agricultural value, why we want to maintain our biodiversity. So wheat, corn, and rice crops that we grow tend to be very, very uniform. So if you get a pest, the wild strains are like a genetic library that we can have access to, so could be a source for a disease-resistant strain. So on your notes, what you're missing there is wheat, corn, and rice crops are uniform, and that skip down, then they can be a source of genes for a disease-resistant strain. Additionally, biological pest controls. We need biodiversity because there are some species that we use to help us be replacements when they become pesticide resistant. So we can use a living organism to help us control those pests, but very carefully. And you have everything for that on your notes. And last but not least, pollinators. So important. Here's a bat that's acting like a pollinator. Ones we know, one we think about right away are bees, right? And I think this is interesting. About 1 out of every 3 bites of food that you had today, so a third of all your bites, were made possible by bees and other pollinators. It is a $15 billion worth of crops every year here in the United States. But actually, I need to check that. That might be I'll find out and tell you in the ad puzzle. But the world's honeybees are in in the United States, sorry, got it. But the world's honeybees are in steep decline, losing about 10 million hives, disappearing in just the last 3 years as of today. One idea about that is colony collapse disorder, that there are mites that are growing on these honeybees and it's destroying those crops. Or destroying those honeybees, and then you don't have those crops. So on your notes, I think you have everything you need for that. All right. Next, consumptive value. So yes, consuming. So on your notes, the cultivation of crops and domestication of animals have been successful. We use a lot of trees for wood and we might cut them down, but if we maybe found some other uses, like in the Peruvian Amazon, they have rubber trees. If you can keep them alive, you can continue to harvest rubber from those trees instead of cutting them down and then you don't have another source. So wood, rubber, and latex are tree products, and really working on that sustained production. All right. Okay, and here is just a picture. This wild species of rubber tree. If you could just keep it alive and stop cutting it down, you could use it for indefinitely, right? And then, as long as its lifetime will go. And then we got to really look at what we're doing to the oceans, right? And the decimation of all the fish and what the fish depend on for food and as a result of overfishing. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So what you need on rubber trees can provide a product indefinitely if kept alive, as long as the tree is alive. All right. Indirect value. Okay, so there's lots of services that ecosystems provide. Healthy biospheres provide protection against floods and droughts and generate and preserve fertile soils. They detoxify and decompose waste. They regulate climate. These are all indirect values that are sometimes hard to measure quantitatively. But it is important that we note these, right, as well. So a lot of times, using the natural ecosystems that we have doing their job is actually cheaper than when we try to do it ourselves, when we try to manufacture it. So a few indirect values. One is all the biogeochemical cycles, and we've learned about those, the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, water cycle, phosphorus cycle. We cannot generate these artificially well, so we need to keep those organisms that are part of those cycles around. So biogeochemical cycles, they contribute to water, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles that we depend on. Just selfishly, we want to keep these going. All right, waste disposal. So on waste disposal, decomposers break down organic matter, other waste, and nutrients used by producers. Decomposition in nature is more economical and more complete than just throwing chemicals, let's say, at sewage treatment. Also, they help with bioremediation and detoxification. So decomposition in nature is more economical and complete. So that's what you want to add there. Provision of fresh water. Get myself over here. Provision of fresh water. Most terrestrial organisms need fresh water. Remember, only 3% of the water on Earth is fresh water, and forests are sponges that will hold and release that water over time. Okay, so sponges is the word you need there. Next, Prevention of soil erosion. Intact ecosystems naturally retain the soil and prevent erosion. And deforestation, when the rains come, it puts silt, fills reservoirs, it denudes hillsides, it goes into the oceans, it covers up coral reefs. So we want to have intact ecosystems to naturally retain and prevent soil erosion. All right, and then climate regulation. Trees provide shade, right? Natural air conditioning. Globally, tropical rainforests act as a sink, right? Because they're doing photosynthesis, fixing carbon, and returning it with oxygen. When you burn trees, not only are you cutting down the factories that generate oxygen for us, right? But they're adding even more carbon into the atmosphere, which contributes, as you know, to global warming. So let me check on your notes on that. So you just need the word shade and natural air conditioning, and I gave you the rest. And then the last one that we're going to talk about is ecotourism. This is just money spent to enjoy natural environments and maybe contribute to their preservation. Globally, ecotourism generates about $77 billion in revenue, and it's one of the fastest growing tourism markets. So if you're trying to preserve something, make it a destination spot, right? So people can enjoy natural environments. And then on biodiversity and natural ecosystems, we want to have on there that we can maximize our, just selfishly, you could maximize resource acquisition and retention in a healthy ecosystem. Grasslands in Minnesota, forests, the more complex they are, the greater the ecosystem performance. And those that have the greatest biodiversity can flex better when there are environmental changes. So on your notes, what you need there is ecosystems with the greatest biodiversity can withstand environmental changes. If you're one of my students, we'll watch this video in class. And not right now. And then this is going to be the conclusion of video 1. And then in video 2, pause this just for a minute. In video 2, I'll talk about the causes of extinction and conservation techniques. And if you're one of my students, I'll see you in class.